The morning sun painted golden streaks across the windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood motionless in his private study. His hands rested on the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandmother, fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood. As his mind wandered to places he wished it would not go, the envelope lay before him, its official seal already broken, the contents having been read and reread until the words were burned into his memory. 3 weeks had passed since that terrible Tuesday when Dr. Harrison had first used words that no husband ever wants to hear about his wife. Catherine had been feeling unwell for months, dismissing the fatigue as stress from their royal duties, the headaches as simply needing better sleep. But when she fainted during a private engagement at a children's hospital, collapsing so suddenly that her security detail barely caught her before she hit the floor, William knew something was seriously wrong. He remembered the drive to the hospital, sitting beside her in the ambulance, watching her pale face as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The paramedics had been professional and calm, but William could see the concern in their eyes as they checked her vital signs and spoke in quiet voices about symptoms he did not understand. The initial tests had been inconclusive, requiring more specialized examinations that stretched over days and then weeks. William had maintained his public appearances, smiling and shaking hands and making appropriate conversation, while his heart hammered against his ribs with worry. Effort it took for her to stand for long periods, the way she would grip his arm a little tighter when she thought no one was looking. They had told their children that Mummy was simply tired, that she needed to see some doctors to help her feel better. But William could see the questions in their young eyes that they were too polite or too frightened to ask. The palace staff had been discreetly informed that the Princess of Wales was undergoing routine medical examinations, but William knew that rumors would eventually begin to spread. In their world, privacy was a luxury that could never be guaranteed, and the constant scrutiny of the press meant that every missed engagement, every canceled appearance, would be analyzed and dissected until the truth emerged. He had watched his father navigate similar challenges, had seen how the weight of public responsibility could crush a person when combined with private pain. The irony was not lost on him that in a life lived so publicly, the moments that mattered most had to be hidden away like precious secrets. Dr. Harrison had been recommended by their personal physician as the best specialist in London for Catherine's particular symptoms, his reputation for both medical excellence and discretion. The doctor's office was located in a private medical facility that catered to patients who required absolute confidentiality. Rather than members of the royal family, the waiting had been the hardest part. William was accustomed to action, to making decisions and moving forward with purpose. But medical tests required patience, and patience had never been his strongest virtue. He had thrown himself into his work with renewed intensity, visiting hospitals and schools and community centers, shaking hands and cutting ribbons while his mind remained focused on Catherine. Every phone call made his heart race. Every message from the palace staff was examined for hidden meaning. Characteristically brave throughout the ordeal, maintaining her composure even when the tests became more invasive and uncomfortable. She had held his hand during the difficult conversations with doctors, had asked intelligent questions about procedures and treatments, had even managed to joke with the nurses about the terrible hospital food. But William could see the fear in her eyes when she thought he was not looking, could feel the tension in her body when she slept beside him, could hear the catch in her voice when she spoke to their children about ordinary things like homework and weekend plans. The palace had developed contingency plans for various scenarios. Though these discussions had taken place in hushed tones behind closed doors, William's private secretary had prepared statements for different possible outcomes, had arranged for additional security measures, had even contacted Catherine's family to ensure they could be reached quickly if needed. The machinery of royal protocol had swung into motion with efficient precision, but all of it felt surreal to William, like preparations for a play in which he did not want to perform. Sleep had become elusive for both of them. William would lie awake listening to Catherine's breathing, grateful for each steady inhale and exhale, terrified of any change in rhythm. He had memorized the patterns of her sleep, the way she would shift and settle, the small sounds she made when dreams visited her, breathing. Their children had sensed the tension, despite their parents' best efforts to maintain normalcy. Family dinners had become quieter affairs, with conversations that felt forced and cheerful in a way that fooled no one. William had caught their eldest child watching Catherine with worried eyes, had seen the way their youngest had begun clinging to his mother with unusual intensity. Children, he realized, were far more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. Standing in his study, with the latest test results in his hands, William felt the weight of 3 weeks of fear and uncertainty pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Today would bring answers, one way or another. Today, he and Catherine would sit across from Dr. Harrison and learn what the future held for their family. The envelope contained preliminary results that had arrived by special courier that morning. But William had not had the courage to read them alone. Some news, he believed, was meant to be shared, whether it brought joy or sorrow. He could hear Catherine moving about in their bedroom. Soon, they would make the journey across London to Dr. Harrison's office, and their lives would take a new direction. William closed his eyes and said a prayer to whatever forces might be listening, asking for strength and courage and the wisdom to face whatever lay ahead with the dignity that his position and his love for Catherine demanded. Catherine stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to William's mother. Her reflection stared back at her with eyes that seemed too large for her face. Dark circles barely concealed by makeup that she had applied with trembling hands. The cream-colored dress she had chosen hung differently on her frame than it had just months ago, and she found herself wondering if anyone else would notice the changes that seemed so obvious to her. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast everything in a soft glow, but Catherine felt as though she were looking at the world through a veil of uncertainty. The past 3 weeks had been the longest of her life. Every morning brought new challenges as she struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy that royal life demanded. Public engagements had become performances requiring enormous effort. Each smile carefully crafted, each handshake measured to hide the tremor in her hands. The children's schedule had remained unchanged because she insisted on it, believing that routine would provide them with the stability they needed while their world shifted beneath their feet. School runs, homework, supervision, bedtime stories, all continued as they always had, though Catherine found herself holding on to these moments with desperate intensity. Sleep had become her enemy. The nights stretched endlessly as she lay beside William, listening to his breathing and knowing that he was awake to. When exhaustion finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with strange scenarios where she was running through endless corridors. She would wake with her heart pounding, reaching instinctively for William's hand in the darkness, finding comfort in his solid presence beside her. The medical appointments had blurred together into a series of sterile rooms and concerned faces. Blood tests, scans, consultations with specialists whose names she struggled to remember. Each procedure brought new questions rather than answers, and Catherine had learned to read the subtle expressions of medical professionals, understanding that their carefully neutral faces often hid concerns they were not yet ready to share. The waiting rooms had become familiar territory, places where time seemed to move differently, where magazines lay unread and conversations happened in hushed tones. Dr. Harrison had been kind throughout the process, explaining each step in language that she could understand, never talking down to her despite her lack of medical knowledge. His office had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could drop the royal mask and simply be a woman seeking answers about her health. The doctor had a way of making even the most frightening procedures seem manageable, his calm presence providing anchor points in the storm of uncertainty that had engulfed her life. Catherine had found herself thinking often about her mother during these difficult weeks. Carol Middleton had been a constant source of strength. Their phone conversations had become daily rituals, brief check-ins that provided Catherine with the maternal reassurance she craved, or updates about ordinary family news that helped Catherine remember. There was a world beyond doctors' offices and test results. The children had been her greatest motivation to remain strong. She watched them with new eyes, memorizing the sound of their laughter. Innocent questions about when she would feel better had broken her heart and strengthened her resolve in equal measure. She had promised them that everything would be fine, a promise she desperately hoped she could keep, but could not guarantee. Royal duties had continued because they had to, but Catherine had found new meaning in the work that had once seemed routine. Hospital visits took on deeper significance as she spoke with patients facing their own medical challenges. Her conversations with charity workers, supporting families in crisis, felt more personal and urgent. Each engagement reminded her of the privilege she had to make a difference in people's lives, but also of how quickly circumstances could change for anyone, regardless of their position or resources. William had been extraordinary throughout the ordeal, though Catherine could see the toll it was taking on him. He maintained his public schedule with characteristic dedication. But she noticed the way his jaw would tighten when he thought no one was looking, the extra moment he would take to compose himself before entering a room. His love for her manifested in countless small gestures, cups of tea appearing at exactly the right moment, his presence beside her during every medical appointment, despite his own demanding schedule. The press had begun to speculate about her reduced public appearances, though the palace communications team had managed the situation with their usual skill. Catherine knew that complete privacy was impossible in their position, but she was grateful for the buffer that allowed her family to process this challenge without constant scrutiny. The weight of public expectation was something she had learned to carry over the years, but illness had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing what truly mattered. Friends had rallied around them with characteristic discretion, offering support without prying into details they knew could not be shared. Dinner invitations had been quietly declined, social obligations postponed, but the understanding and concern of their circle had been a source of comfort. Catherine had been touched by the thoughtful messages and small gifts that arrived without fanfare, reminders that they were not facing this alone. The morning routine had become a meditation of sorts, each step carefully performed as she prepared to face whatever news awaited them. The pearl necklace, fastened with fingers that remembered the motion from countless similar mornings. Hair arranged in the style that had become her signature, though today it felt like armor rather than personal expression. Now, today would bring answers one way or another. The uncertainty that had dominated their lives for 3 weeks would finally come to an end. Not for any specific outcome, but for the strength to face whatever lay ahead with grace and courage. The drive to Dr. Harrison's office would be their last journey into the unknown. Whatever news awaited them, there would reshape their understanding of their future, their plans, their hopes. Catherine took one final look in the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door where William was waiting. Together, they would face whatever came next. The car moved through London's busy streets with practiced ease. But inside the vehicle, time seemed to crawl at an impossible pace. William sat beside Catherine, their hands intertwined on the leather seat between them, both staring out their respective windows at a city that appeared unchanged by their personal crisis. The familiar landmarks of their route to Dr. Harrison's office had taken on new significance over the past weeks, becoming waypoints in a journey neither had wanted to take. Red double-decker buses carried tourists and commuters alike. People walking dogs paused at street corners. Children in school uniforms hurried along sidewalks. All part of London's endless rhythm that continued regardless of royal worries. Catherine found herself focusing on small details she had never noticed before. The way morning light caught the glass windows of office buildings, creating patterns that shifted and changed as their car moved past. A woman pushing a pram across a zebra crossing, her face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that comes from ordinary moments. An elderly man feeding pigeons in a small park, surrounded by birds that fluttered and pecked at breadcrumbs with grateful enthusiasm. These glimpses of normal life felt precious somehow, reminders that the world contained beauty and simplicity even when personal circumstances felt overwhelming and complex. William's mind wandered to their children, who were at school at this very moment, probably sitting in classrooms learning about mathematics or history or literature, blissfully unaware that their parents were traveling toward news that might change everything. He had kissed each of them goodbye that morning with extra tenderness, lingering a moment longer than usual, memorizing the sleepy warmth of their hugs and the casual way they had wished him a good day. Their youngest had reminded him about a football match scheduled for the weekend, speaking with the confident assumption that life would continue exactly as planned. William hoped desperately that this assumption would prove correct. The security detail maintained their professional distance, but William could sense their concern in the subtle ways they communicated with each other and the extra attention they paid to the route and surrounding traffic. These men and women had protected his family for years, becoming familiar presences who understood the delicate balance between safety and privacy that royal life required. They had witnessed moments of joy and celebration, had been present during times of grief and difficulty, and their quiet competence provided a sense of stability that William valued more than they probably realized. Dr. Harrison's medical facility appeared ahead of them, its modern glass facade reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. The building had been designed with privacy in mind, its entrance discreet enough to allow high-profile patients to come and go without attracting unwanted attention. William had researched the facility extensively when Catherine's condition first required specialist care, learning about its reputation for both medical excellence and absolute discretion. The staff had been trained to handle sensitive situations with the kind of professionalism that made difficult circumstances slightly more bearable. As their car pulled into the private parking area, Catherine felt her heart rate accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The butterflies in her stomach had transformed into something more intense, a nervous energy that made sitting still almost impossible. She had been preparing for this moment for days, rehearsing in her mind how she would react to different scenarios. But now that the time had arrived, all her mental preparations felt inadequate. William squeezed her hand gently, a gesture that conveyed understanding and support without the need for words. The walk from the car to the building's entrance felt both too long and too short. Catherine's heels clicked against the pavement with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet courtyard. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of flowers from carefully maintained gardens that surrounded the building. She found herself breathing deeply, as if storing up this moment of freshness. Before entering the controlled environment of medical offices with their distinctive smell of cleaning products and efficiency, Dr. Harrison's receptionist greeted them with a kind of warm professionalism that suggested she had been carefully briefed about their situation. The waiting area was designed to feel more like a comfortable living room than a medical facility, with soft lighting, tasteful artwork, and furniture arranged to encourage relaxation rather than anxiety. Classical music played softly in the background, something peaceful and instrumental that helped mask the nervous tension that seemed to radiate from other patients. Scattered throughout the space, William noticed an elderly couple sitting across from them. The woman holding her husband's hand in much the same way Catherine held his. Their faces bore the same expression of worried anticipation that he recognized from his own reflection in recent weeks. Medical challenges, he realized, were great equalizers that affected people regardless of their circumstances or social position. Everyone in this waiting room was facing uncertainty. Everyone was hoping for good news. Everyone understood the peculiar mixture of hope and fear that accompanied serious health concerns. Catherine picked up a magazine from the coffee table, found herself unable to focus on the words. The pages turned automatically under her fingers, while her mind remained fixed on the conversation that awaited them behind Dr. Harrison's office door. She had practiced staying calm, had rehearsed appropriate responses to various scenarios, but now she felt like an actor who had forgotten all her lines just before going on stage. William's presence beside her provided comfort, but she knew that whatever news they received would affect both of them equally. A middle-aged man sat alone, checking his phone repeatedly with the nervous energy of someone expecting important news. A young woman about Catherine's age read the same page of her book over and over, her concentration clearly elsewhere. An older gentleman dozed fitfully in a corner chair, his wife watching him with the tender concern that comes from decades of marriage. Each person carried their own burden of hope and worry, their own collection of fears and possibilities. Time moved strangely in the waiting room, minutes stretching like hours while simultaneously rushing past too quickly. Catherine found herself counting breaths, listening to the soft tick of a wall clock that marked seconds with mechanical precision. The classical music shifted from one piece to another, creating a soundtrack for anticipation that felt both soothing and somehow ominous. William checked his watch repeatedly, though he knew that Dr. Harrison would call them when ready, and that their appointment time was still several minutes away. When the door to the inner offices finally opened and Dr. Harrison appeared, both William and Catherine felt their hearts jump simultaneously. The doctor's expression was professionally neutral, revealing nothing about the news he carried. His greeting was warm but measured, the carefully modulated tone of someone who delivered life-changing information on a regular basis. As they stood, to follow him down the familiar corridor toward his office, Catherine realized that the next few minutes would determine the direction of their entire future. Dr. Harrison's office felt different this time as William and Catherine settled into the familiar leather chairs facing his desk. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the polished wood floor. But the warmth of the light seemed unable to penetrate the cool atmosphere of medical professionalism that filled the room. Catherine noticed details she had missed during previous visits. The way the doctor's diplomas hung in perfect alignment on the wall behind his desk, the small family photographs arranged precisely beside his computer monitor, the leather-bound medical journals stacked with careful attention to height and order. William found himself studying Dr. Harrison's face for any hint of what was to come. The doctor had perfected the art of maintaining neutral expressions during difficult conversations, but William had learned to read subtle signs during their previous meetings. The way the doctor's hands moved as he organized papers on his desk, the slight pause before he spoke, the careful modulation of his voice that suggested he was choosing words with particular care. Today, something felt different. Though William could not identify exactly what had changed in the doctor's demeanor, the manila folder containing Catherine's test results lay closed on the desk between them, like a barrier that separated their current uncertainty from whatever future awaited them. Catherine stared at the folder, knowing that inside those pages lay answers to questions that had consumed her thoughts for weeks, medical terminology that she had learned to understand. Numbers and percentages that would determine treatment options, recommendations that would shape the months and possibly years ahead. The folder seemed both insignificant and monumentally important, just paper and ink that contained the power to reshape their entire world. Dr. Harrison began speaking in his characteristic, measured tone, explaining the complexity of Catherine's case and the thoroughness of the testing process they had completed. His words washed over William like waves, each sentence building toward conclusions that remained just out of reach. The doctor spoke about cellular activity and treatment protocols, about statistical probabilities and clinical outcomes, using language that was both precise and somehow comforting in its technical certainty. Catherine found herself leaning forward slightly, as if physical proximity to the doctor's words might help her understand their full implications. The explanation continued with discussions of different treatment approaches, each option presented with careful attention to benefits and risks. William felt his mind trying to process information that seemed to shift between hopeful and concerning, depending on which aspects Dr. Harrison emphasized. The doctor's office, with its comfortable furniture and reassuring atmosphere, had become a place where their future was being negotiated through medical terminology and clinical experience. Catherine asked questions with a kind of focused intelligence that had always impressed William, seeking clarification on points that mattered most to their family's planning. As Dr. Harrison continued his explanation, William began to notice subtle changes in the doctor's tone that suggested the conversation was moving toward more encouraging territory. The careful neutrality that had characterized his previous discussions with them seemed to be giving way to something that sounded almost like optimism. Catherine apparently sensed the same shift, because William felt her hand relax slightly. In his, the tension that had been building in her shoulders beginning to ease in small, almost imperceptible increments. The doctor opened the manila folder and began sharing specific test results, pointing to charts and graphs that illustrated Catherine's condition with scientific precision. The numbers told a story that was more complex than William had anticipated. But as Dr. Harrison explained their significance, a picture began to emerge that was markedly different from the worst-case scenarios that had haunted their sleepless nights. Catherine's case, while serious, fell into a category that offered genuine reasons for hope and confidence about successful treatment. William felt something shift inside his chest as the full implications of Dr. Harrison's words began to penetrate his understanding. The fear that had been his constant companion for weeks started to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of relief that he hardly dared to acknowledge. Catherine's eyes had begun to brighten with unshed tears, but for the first time in their ordeal, these tears seemed to carry hope rather than despair. The doctor continued his explanation with increasing warmth, his professional demeanor softening as he shared treatment options that offered excellent prognoses. The discussion moved from diagnosis to treatment planning, with Dr. Harrison outlining a comprehensive approach that would require time and commitment, but offered every reason to expect full recovery. The medical team he recommended included specialists whose reputations William recognized from his research, doctors whose expertise in Catherine's specific condition was internationally acknowledged. The treatment protocol would be demanding, but manageable, allowing Catherine to continue many of her normal activities while addressing her health concerns with appropriate medical intervention. Catherine asked about the timeline for treatment and recovery, her voice steady but carrying undertones of emotion that she was working to control. Dr. Harrison's response was encouraging, explaining that while the process would require several months of careful monitoring and treatment, the expected outcome was complete resolution of her symptoms and a return to full health. The doctor's confidence in this prognosis was evident in his relaxed posture and the genuine smile that had replaced his earlier professional caution. The conversation turned to practical matters of scheduling treatments and coordinating with Catherine's royal duties. Dr. Harrison had clearly given thought to the unique requirements of treating a member of the royal family, suggesting appointment times and treatment locations that would provide the privacy and security their situation demanded. His understanding of their need for discretion while maintaining their public responsibilities demonstrated the kind of comprehensive care that went beyond purely medical considerations. As their meeting drew toward its conclusion, William felt a profound sense of gratitude toward Dr. Harrison and his team. The careful attention they had received, the thoroughness of the diagnostic process, and the clear communication throughout their ordeal had provided exactly the kind of support they needed during one of the most challenging periods of their lives. Catherine expressed similar appreciation, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been in weeks. The final minutes of their appointment were spent discussing follow-up procedures and answering remaining questions about the treatment process. Dr. Harrison provided them with written materials explaining the recommended approach and contact information for the specialists who would be involved in Catherine's care. As they prepared to leave his office, the doctor's handshake felt different than it had during previous visits, warmer and more personal, as if they were parting as friends rather than simply doctor and patients. Walking back through the corridor toward the waiting room, William and Catherine moved with lighter steps than they had carried into the building. The oppressive weight of uncertainty that had characterized their journey to this appointment had been replaced by something that felt almost like joy, though both were still processing the full implications of what they had learned. The journey back to Kensington Palace felt like traveling through a completely different city than the one they had driven through just hours earlier. London's streets sparkled with a vibrancy that William and Catherine had not noticed during their anxious morning trip to Dr. Harrison's office. The same red buses and black taxis moved through traffic with what seemed like renewed purpose. Pedestrians walked with lighter steps, and even the gray London sky appeared brighter, as if someone had adjusted the color settings of their entire world. Catherine sat beside William with her hands still clasped in his, but now their intertwined fingers spoke of celebration rather than fear. William found himself studying Catherine's profile as she gazed out the car window, noting the relaxation in her features that he had not seen for weeks. The tension lines around her eyes had softened, and her breathing had returned to the natural rhythm he remembered from happier times. She looked younger somehow, as if the weight of uncertainty had been physically lifting her down, and its removal had restored something essential to her appearance. The cream-colored dress that had seemed to loose that morning now looked elegant rather than concerning, and her pearl necklace caught the light with a brilliance that matched the renewed sparkle in her eyes. The phone calls they needed to make created a pleasant sort of urgency that was entirely different from the dread that had characterized their recent communications. Catherine had already called her mother from the car, her voice breaking with joy as she shared the good news that Carol Middleton had been waiting weeks to hear. The conversation had been brief but emotional, with both women crying tears of relief and happiness, while William listened with a smile that felt foreign on his face after so many days of worry. Her mother's excitement had been audible even from William's seat, and they had promised to visit that weekend to share the full details in person. William's own call to his father had been characteristically brief but deeply meaningful. King Charles had been following Catherine's situation with the kind of quiet concern that the royal family had learned to manage during medical crises, offering support without interfering in decisions that belonged to William and Catherine alone. The relief in his father's voice when William shared Dr. Harrison's diagnosis had been unmistakable, and they had discussed practical matters of adjusting Catherine's schedule to accommodate her treatment while maintaining the royal duties that could not be postponed. The conversation had ended with an invitation to bring the children for dinner that weekend, a family gathering that now promised to be celebration rather than consultation. The palace staff would need to be informed, had agreed to handle these conversations personally rather than delegating them to private secretaries or communications teams. The people who worked most closely with them had been worried sick during the weeks of uncertainty, and they deserved to hear good news directly from Catherine herself. The thought of sharing relief instead of devastating news felt like a gift. They were eager to give to people who had supported them with such professional discretion and personal concern throughout their ordeal. Catherine's thoughts turned repeatedly to their children, who were still at school, completely unaware that their parents' world had shifted so dramatically since they had left for classes that morning. The conversation they would have that evening had been rehearsed in dozens of different ways, depending on what news Dr. Harrison might have delivered. But now Catherine found herself looking forward to a discussion that would reassure rather than prepare them for difficult times ahead. She imagined their faces when they learned that Mummy was going to be completely fine, that the doctors had found exactly the right treatment, that family life would continue much as it always had. The treatment protocol Dr. Harrison had outlined would require some adjustments to their routine, but nothing that would significantly disrupt their family life or Catherine's royal duties. Regular appointments with specialists, medication that would need to be taken on a precise schedule, some lifestyle modifications that were easily manageable. All small prices to pay for the promise of complete recovery. Catherine had been prepared for much more invasive treatments, possibly including surgery or therapies that would have required extended periods away from her family and responsibilities. William's mind was already moving toward practical planning. Considering how they would coordinate Catherine's treatment schedule with their existing commitments, the royal calendar was planned months in advance, but their private secretaries were skilled at making adjustments when necessary. Some engagements might need to be rescheduled, some travel plans modified, but nothing that would create significant problems or require public explanations that invaded their privacy. The palace communications team could handle any press inquiries with the standard response about private medical matters, while focusing attention on their continuing royal duties. The security implications of Catherine's treatment had been carefully considered by Dr. Harrison's team, who had experience managing high-profile patients with complex privacy requirements. The medical facility was equipped to handle their security needs without compromising the quality of care, and the specialists involved in Catherine's treatment had been carefully vetted for both their medical expertise and their discretion. These practical considerations had been sources of stress during the diagnostic period, but now they simply represented logistics to be managed rather than problems to be solved. Catherine found herself thinking about the royal patronages and charitable organizations she supported, many of which focused on health-related causes. Her personal experience with medical uncertainty would undoubtedly deepen her understanding of what patients and families faced during health crises, adding authenticity to her advocacy work that could benefit countless others. The thought of transforming her frightening experience into something that could help other people felt like finding purpose in what had initially seemed like meaningless suffering. The car turned through the familiar gates of Kensington Palace, and both William and Catherine felt the profound satisfaction of returning home with good news, rather than the devastating information they had feared. The palace gardens looked more beautiful than they had in weeks, with spring flowers beginning to bloom and trees showing the first hints of new growth. Even the formal architecture of their home seemed warmer and more welcoming, as if the building itself was celebrating their relief and renewed hope for the future. As they walked toward their front door, William realized that they were about to cross a threshold that would separate the period of uncertainty from their new reality of hope and healing. Catherine paused for a moment with her hand on the door handle, looking at William with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears of joy. Behind this door waited their children, their staff, their normal life that had been shadowed by fear, but could now return to its natural rhythm of love, responsibility, and royal service. The sound of their children's voices could be heard from inside the palace, probably discussing their school day over afternoon tea. completely unaware that their parents were about to share news that would restore peace to their family's world. William's hand trembled slightly as he turned the brass door handle of their private residence, the same handle he had touched thousands of times before, but today it felt different, charged with the weight of good news that was about to transform their family's world. The door swung open to reveal the warm, familiar chaos of their home in the late afternoon, with children's backpacks scattered near the entrance, school shoes kicked off in careless abandon, and the distant sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen where their children were probably enjoying their after-school snack. The scent of home enveloped them immediately. That unique combination of fresh flowers from the arrangements that were changed weekly, the lingering aroma of lunch prepared by their personal chef, and something indefinable that belonged only to their family. Catherine stepped across the threshold beside William, her hand still clasped in his, and both of them paused for a moment to absorb the simple miracle of being home with hearts full of hope rather than heavy with dread. The afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting familiar patterns across the polished wooden floors, and everything looked exactly as they had left it that morning, yet somehow completely transformed by their changed perspective. Their youngest child appeared, first, running toward them with the boundless energy that only children possess, his school uniform slightly rumpled from a day of learning and playing, his face bright with the uncomplicated joy of seeing his parents return home. He launched himself into Catherine's arms with a kind of enthusiastic embrace that reminded her of everything she had feared losing during the dark weeks of uncertainty. His chatter about his day, about friends and teachers and playground adventures, filled the entrance hall with the music of normal family life that Catherine had worried she might never hear with the same carefree heart. William scooped up their middle child, who had followed close behind, spinning him around in a spontaneous burst of celebration that made the boy giggle with delight. The sound of their children's laughter, so natural and unguarded, struck both parents with renewed force, reminding them of all the future moments they would now be able to share without the shadow of illness hanging over their family. These were the sounds they had been fighting to preserve, the ordinary magical moments that made up the fabric of their life together. Their eldest child appeared in the doorway, leading to the kitchen, more reserved in the way that children become as they grow older and more aware of adult concerns, but her eyes lit up when she saw her parents' faces. She had been the most perceptive of their children during the difficult weeks, the one who had asked the most careful questions and watched Catherine with worried eyes that seemed too mature for her age. Now, seeing her parents' relaxed expressions and genuine smiles, she moved toward them with visible relief, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. The kitchen buzzed with activity as their nanny finished preparing the children's afternoon snack, her face brightening when she saw William and Catherine enter with their arms full of happy children. She had been with their family for years, becoming more like an extended family member than an employee, and her worry during Catherine's health crisis had been genuine and deeply felt. The smile that spread across her face when she saw their expressions told Catherine that good news was written clearly in their demeanor, readable even before words were spoken. Catherine settled into her favorite chair at the kitchen table, gathering her children around her with the kind of relaxed joy that had been missing from their interactions for too long. William leaned against the kitchen counter, watching his family with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears of relief and gratitude. The simple scene of children eating fruit and talking about their school day had become precious beyond measure, a gift they would never again take for granted. Every ordinary moment now carried the weight of how easily it could have been lost. The conversation they had been planning for weeks finally began, but it felt nothing like the difficult discussions they had rehearsed in private. Instead of explaining scary medical terms or preparing their children for uncertain times ahead, Catherine found herself sharing news that brought immediate smiles to their faces. She spoke in simple terms about feeling better about doctors who had found exactly the right treatment, about how their family life would continue just as it always had. The relief in their children's eyes was instant and complete, as if they had been carrying worries they had never voiced. Their youngest child, with the practical directness that small children possess, asked if this meant Mummy would be able to come to his school's sports day next week. Catherine's answer, delivered with a laugh that sounded like music after weeks of carefully modulated responses, was an enthusiastic yes that made him clap his hands with delight. Such simple requests had carried enormous weight during the period of uncertainty. When every future commitment had felt like a promise she might not be able to keep, the palace staff began arriving one by one, drawn by the sound of genuine laughter and celebration that had been absent from their home for too long. William and Catherine's private secretary appeared first, her professional composure cracking slightly when she saw their faces and realized that the news was good. She had been managing their schedules with the kind of careful attention that prepared for various scenarios, and the relief in her expression was profound as she understood that the most feared possibilities would not come to pass. Their security, detail ever present but usually invisible, allowed themselves small smiles of satisfaction as they witnessed the family's joy. These men and women had protected them through many challenges over the years, but medical crises presented unique difficulties that tested everyone's professional boundaries. Seeing the family they had guarded so carefully return to happiness, it felt like a personal victory for each of them. The evening unfolded with the kind of natural rhythm that had been missing from their lives for weeks. Homework was completed with patience rather than distraction. Dinner conversation flowed easily. Bedtime stories were read with the kind of attention that comes from renewed appreciation for simple pleasures. William and Catherine found themselves lingering longer than usual during their children's bedtime routines, savoring the ordinary moments that had been shadowed by fear, but could now be enjoyed with pure hearts as night fell over Kensington Palace. William and Catherine stood together, in their bedroom, finally alone to process the magnitude of what had occurred. The morning had begun with fear and uncertainty, but it was ending with hope and gratitude that seemed to fill every corner of their home. The future stretched ahead of them once again, bright with possibility and freed from the weight of medical uncertainty that had dominated their thoughts for so long. Their family was whole, their love was strong, and tomorrow would bring new adventures rather than new fears. The door they had opened that afternoon had indeed revealed what awaited them. Not in Dr. Harrison's office, but in their own home, where ordinary miracles happened every day and love conquered even the darkest worries.